So yeah, we're kind of going into our Mod 1 project, right? Your first end of module project. I will say like these are quote unquote the only things that matter. That's not true, but like all the stuff you've been doing it matters. But this is the mod project is the thing that we're going to like do an assessment off of, and this is where I like to kind of like say um, it's a little sneakier in the sense that like it's not really like just to assess you on like, you know, if you understood the material and stuff like this and you can do this, but it's also, you should see your mod project as something that you can put on your resume, put on your portfolio, show on GitHub and stuff like that, that you can talk about. So you can say like, hey, I did this project, and you can talk in detail and stuff like this. It's really useful to have like on your GitHub profile and everything like that to show like, hey, look, I've been doing things and here's a project I've done. So that's kind of like what you should think of your module projects. I will also say is that we'll kind of talk about the criteria and stuff like this that we have in the module projects. There's not a reason why you can't be like, oh no, like I have all these things, I want to do even more on this project, but I already turned it in, I can't touch it anymore. You know, you later on, you can totally go back to your projects and like change things up, do new versions of it. You know, if you learn new stuff, because you guys are going to learn a lot of different things, right? You can always add that information or add that new stuff into your projects as you learn and grow. Make sense? Cool. All right. And awesome. I see a couple of more people came in, and I think said Nyla. Awesome. Cool. All right. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And sorry, I had a whole bunch of tabs open prepared for you guys, and I realized I can't find them. I probably closed them earlier. So you guys can all see my screen here. So this is just from the repo. So I'm going to go through some I'm trying to think where my notes are. I think. Sorry, I'm kind of going through my head a little bit. All right, so this should all be on like the repo. You guys don't know how to find the repo now for the resources I keep going through, right? Yeah, okay, cool. So I have this new part, movie analysis. So I'm going to share this part and we'll talk about this stuff. So I'm sure you guys are all really excited about, you know, like doing this project and everything like that. This is, I think some people, I think Nadine shared Eli's video, right, of like the project, stuff like that. Yeah, so I think that was a really good one too, right? So like you can kind of see a little bit. I'll go into some extra detail, and this next week is going to be, well, next couple weeks is going to be all about like, you know, basically office hours and stuff. So we'll kind of go through this timeline, what this project is. So kind of looking forward, a little bit of like the timeline, just to kind of clarify some extra stuff, like what's going on for this next couple weeks. So the first thing is like, you know, we are now like in project mode. So it starts now. The next 2 weeks actually turns into office hours. So normally we've had study groups where we talk about like the curriculum material. So the idea is like you've been reading through the material, practicing stuff like that with the study group to kind of reinforce, you know, ask questions and stuff like that. These next 2 weeks are turning into office hours. So what that means is that study groups twice a week, right, are instead going to be kind of more open to be like, if you guys have questions about the project, if you guys want to share what you're doing right now. I'll sometimes talk about in office hours, like specific details. For example, I'm sure all of you guys are Git masters at this point, but for anyone who's not a master in Git and GitHub, we'll definitely kind of walk through some, you know, ways to do like how to manage, you know, projects and stuff like this and what to look at. And then of course, you know, there's specific questions about the project we can ask them during then. Okay. So that's kind of like what's this next couple study groups, or I guess office hours are going to look like for the next couple weeks. Make sense, everyone? Okay, so we'll start that next week, which I guess is technically the beginning of March, right? So March 3rd-ish week, right? And so we'll do that for 2 weeks, and then we'll actually have assessments on, in this case, March 16th at the end of those 2 weeks. So I already have it on the cohort calendar. If you guys check it out like on learn.co, right, you should be able to find there's a little thing that says project assessments begins. Yeah, Mod 1 project assessments. And so a couple things to note about this is that over these next couple of weeks, you're basically going to just work on the project. There's no new material launch. There's nothing for you to kind of like new to go through. Maybe you do some catch up and stuff. That's perfectly fine. But basically your goal is to focus on that project. The assessments are basically going to replace the one-on-one. So I think the README in the curriculum actually says like, oh, it replaces it with a 45-minute session. I actually make it a 1 hour session. So note that's like twice as long as our normal one-on-ones. And so the reason why is because 45 minutes is really like the assessment where we kind of like do the project, you know, we talk it through. I'll talk about that in a second. And then 15 minutes is really just to give you feedback. So I like to give you guys feedback right when you guys finish the assessment, because that way you can know a little bit, like even if you pass the assessment and everything, it's nice to know like how you can improve, what things you can do in the future, you know, all that stuff. And it's fresh in your mind because we just did it and stuff like that. And so I like to give you guys feedback immediately. Plus, to be quite honest, I'm not super fast necessarily. I'm finishing everyone's project assessment and the giving you feedback right away. So I like to give you guys that at least right after you finish the assessment. That way you can work off of things and you can do what you need to. And also I will tell you, you know, right then and there after the assessment is whether or not, you know, basically passed or not, you know, or things that say, oh, these are glaring issues. These are things that you might have to fix before we can like pass it through. In general, though, I'll try to be upfront with you guys. So that way nothing's surprised where I don't email you later on and say, oh, by the way, you're gonna have to redo the assessment. Because I don't think that's fair to you guys. Okay, does that make sense?
Sorry, question. Is the one-on-ones going to be with you or with our like assigned one-on-one instructor?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's right. Because some people don't have me as an instructor. So I have to talk with Eli and I think maybe another instructor. But basically, if you have another instructor you're doing one-on-ones with, I think I'm going to talk with them and just kind of see what works well. I think sometimes
I just had my one-on-one with Eli, and he was like, "I'll do it with you." So
yeah,
like with him.
Yeah, if you have Eli, Eli's going to be like very excited to like do everything. But he's great. So yeah, basically the same idea. So all this stuff should still apply. It might be a little bit different, but it should still be, you know, the different parts of the assessment. You still turn it through and learn, but it might be a different instructor. And I should really say is that even if you have an instructor like me as an instructor, it's possible you might have to do the assessment with another instructor. But in general, it's the same idea. Good question, Johnny. Does that kind of clarify things?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, you should definitely, if you don't have me as an instructor, definitely ask whoever you have in your one-on-one, say, hey, by the way, are we doing assessments now with each other and stuff like that? And of course, you know, I might talk with the instructors as well and see, you know, like, okay, like, you know, if they're, for example, really swamped for whatever reason, I might still take on that assessment just to kind of help things out. Okay, cool. All right. I'm glad you brought that up, Johnny, because I honestly would have forgot. One other thing I'll mention is that we're going to start module 2 when assessments begin. So this is my motivation for you guys, is that like you have 2 weeks, and 2 weeks is going to feel like, oh, wow, we don't have any new material. I can take it easy, you know, just kind of float through this project. Don't do that, because I will tell you is that once March 16th starts up, right, that's when we'll start doing assessments and stuff. But at that same time, we're going to start learning new material in module 2. So you'll still have your assessment and everything like that. But if you kind of like think like, well, you know, I'll talk about like how long you have. You have 2 weeks to finish the assessment. If you wait until like that 2 weeks and you don't do any of the module 2 material, you're going to feel already behind, like just starting that new module. So my motivation for you guys is before that March 16th happens, is have your be ready to do your assessment. That way you don't have any new stuff to go through. Now I will say, if you are feeling a little behind, you're like, oh shoot, like I had to do a whole bunch of stuff for my project before it's ready, then you know you can take more time stuff. But I say try not to use that as a crutch, if that makes sense. Is that clear to everyone? I see some general head nods. Any questions about this assessment starting up?
So I'm not sure if you're going to answer that later where it says due March 30th. What would be the difference between like the assessment and the due date?
Oh yeah, so that's a good point. I see Nyla, I'll get to you right in a second. But assessments basically will start on March 16th, and then due March 30th is kind of like the last time you can like do the assessment. So it's within 2 weeks of starting assessments. It's a little confusing, but I also put this on the color calendar as well. So that's kind of like you have to do your assessment within that time period. Makes sense? Okay. Okay. And then Nyla, you had a question. At least I saw you unmute.
Yeah, it was, so that's what I was gonna ask, so that we're all gonna schedule our assessments on the 16th, or we're gonna be able to schedule it different days, and then if we have to work on it, it'll be due to the 30th.
A good point. It's gonna be throughout those 2 weeks from March 16th through the March 30th. And I say as much as possible, try to sign up for a time, just like you sign up for one-on-ones, sign up for a time March 16th through March 20th. I'm looking at the calendar at the same time, that first week. That way, what we're going to talk about is like what happens if you don't have, you know, let's say you do the assessment and, you know, I say, or an instructor says, you know what, it's not quite there, but it's almost, here's things you can change. You have that second week to make those changes and fix it up. Okay. So that kind of leads us right into this due by March 30th. So basically your March 30th is kind of like your final deadline. Basically, like you have to have the assessment within that time and pass the assessment. You actually have up to 2 tries to actually complete the assessment. And part of that is because we don't want you to like stress out constantly going over and over and over the assessment. This might sound kind of scary, like, oh my gosh, I only have 2 tries and then like, you know, like I don't pass the assessment. In reality, is that even like during, like before the assessment comes, I'm usually talking with you guys. I'm kind of chatting with you either through Slack or through one-on-ones. We generally know a little bit of like how well you're doing and like, you know, what things you need help with. So like there shouldn't be a point where like you get to the assessment and you're like, oh, I'm really lost. I wasn't able to finish this part. Because I'd be like, hey, we've had 2 weeks. Why haven't you talked to me? You know, why didn't you tell me? So, and that's not a judgment thing. That's just like, hey, just let me know. Like, I'm here to help. Like, I'm not here to say like, oh, you should know this stuff already, like, and scold you. I'm here to basically help you out and see like, you know, if there's things that you need to like, you know, say, oh, you're stuck on a certain aspect. So in general though, is that we have 2 weeks and March 30th is that 2-week mark. And then you have 2 tries to basically do it. And usually if you like, let's say the assessment, you're missing some piece of it. I will say, okay, like this is the part that you're missing. These are the things that you have to do to pass the project, right? And I'll make that really explicit for you guys. That way, you know, if there is something you're like, oh, you know what, like you didn't pass through, we have to do another try. It's not gonna be a huge deal. Usually, in fact, typically when I've had this situation, it's like, oh, if you're missing this part, you need to add this into your technical notebook and then you should be good to go. Like we might not even do like a full another assessment. So that's just to make sure that, you know, you are fulfilling the requirements. And also, honestly, it's a project that you would want to talk about, you know, with a recruiter or whoever you're talking with. That makes sense, everyone? Cool. Any questions at this point? I know I'm kind of, I feel like I'm going through it really quickly, but hopefully it's making sense. Okay, cool. I'll move on then. All right, so quick thing is about where to get help, right? Like, so, okay, we're in project mode, you're working on the project, what do you do if you need some help? So first thing basically is that you have me, right? So you can definitely ask during office hours and stuff like that. But let's say you have a really specific question. I mentioned this like maybe a couple weeks ago is the DS support squad, this tag. And so this tag basically, if you do this on Slack, if you like, you know, you can @ Victor, right? And like you'll like ping me over like on this main Slack channel. You can ping this, I guess, I don't know what to call it, like this handle. And what this will do is this will ping basically all the instructors that are available. So use this, you know, great power comes great responsibility, right? So like, don't just like do this for fun. It's like, hey, how's it going? And like all the instructors go through and then we're gonna start muting people. No, but if you have a question, then that way, you know, for example, if I'm not available or just anyone, and honestly, some of the instructors have more experience on certain aspects of it. We have our different strengths and weaknesses. So if someone feels like really comfortable asking this question or like answering this question, they'll kind of jump in and stuff like that. So this is a really useful tool. I know I haven't really talked too much about it, but I think using this, and this is honestly a little bit new for us as instructors, but I think it's a really helpful thing because it's that way you don't have to like ping Victor and then like say, oh, well, Victor's not answering right now because he's busy for whatever reason. He's just like sleeping or whatever. You can like ping someone else, you know, you can just ping this guy. Okay, cool, makes sense. All right, awesome. And then there's a few Slack channels that I want to mention about that are on the Slack right now. DSPC users. So if you have a PC, so if you have Windows, sometimes you can get in these weird parts. I really should have mentioned this before, but you can basically join this channel, and those are basically everyone who's using a PC and probably knows more about Windows than I do. I do use Windows, but not like on the regular basis. I try to avoid Windows as much as possible. I'm a Unix man myself, I'm sorry. But if you're using a PC, this can be really useful, especially if you're getting very specific errors that are around Windows and stuff like this. Then we have the module Python DS and the module data engineering. This one in particular is kind of focused more on this first module, but there might be some data engineering parts that you might ask. These are great questions where other students are on there, other instructors are available there, so you can ask questions on there, especially if you're like, oh, this is a very specific thing and you want someone beyond just the cohort. You can ask this and this will kind of like show, you know, it's like a cohort channel, but it's for all the people who are joined on it. So it can be really useful. And kind of speaking of cohort channel, I know people love to like message me, but I don't know everything. And, you know, sometimes I'm also really busy, you know, like, and I try my best to try to get back to you guys, but you guys probably see sometimes there's a little bit of lag time. You know, if you have a question, don't feel shy to like just ask it on the cohort channel or one of these channels. People might also have that same question. Sometimes I get like the same question multiple times. Like, it's kind of funny sometimes. Sometimes I'll get it within like an hour of each other of people asking the same exact question, which I just think is hilarious because I think you guys are conspiring to like ask me questions. But if you ask it on the cohort channel or one of these channels, someone else might also chime in who's already solved this issue, or they might say, oh yeah, you know, could you go into more detail about this and whatnot? So don't feel shy about doing that and helping each other out. Okay. Cool. Any questions about these channels, this support group? Cool. I don't know the best way to share this because like I feel like if I share this again, I'll just ping all the instructors, but I don't know. Maybe I'll wait. Maybe I'll do this like at like 1 a.m. sometime, just like bother everyone. So one kind of note on this share and help one another, you can make your own study groups on Learn. And this is something that past students have done and like done like little study groups to kind of work on the project together. You know, it can be motivating in the sense that like you kind of talk to other people, see what they're doing, kind of like, you know, we're remote, but you can almost imagine like getting together to like make work on the project. I've even had some students who have literally are living in the same area and they'll actually meet physically and stuff like that and like work on the project together. So that's always an option as well. Don't feel scared to like share what you're doing. Don't think like, I think sometimes we get this very classic, like traditional schooling mentality of like, if people see what I'm doing, it's cheating. Am I right? Like, do you guys have that like deep down a little bit? Like if you like share something, it feels a little wrong, right? Like, it's kind of like that kind of deal. Don't feel ashamed because like in reality, it's like when you're working as a data scientist, working in like any environment, you're sharing your information. You're not keeping it secret in general, like with your coworkers, right? You're working off of each other and you guys are learning too. So the only thing you can do is just benefit. This is where obviously like honor code, I don't even like bother saying the honor code because it's like, if you really are trying to like copy someone else's stuff, it's like, I don't know what you're trying to fool. Like, you know, it's kind of like, oh, you're here to like practice it. Like the projects are a great time to practice. So in general, feel free to share with each other, say, hey, you know, on the Slack channel, say, hey, you know, here's my work, you know, check it out. What do you guys think, you know? And, you know, feel free to like add that contribution or say, hey, like, this is pretty cool. That's really cool what someone did there. I'm going to try that myself, you know? And if you feel like it's something like really major, definitely credit them, you know, like in your project and say, hey, you know, so-and-so did this, you know, actually here's a link to their project or whatnot. This is a great way to do collaboration and stuff. Okay, cool. I want to emphasize that because I think it's like really grained into like in people's heads, like, it's like I can't share my information because it's like something's wrong with that, like it's cheating or something. So don't stress about that. Okay, cool. All right, so that's kind of like the overall general like assessment logistics stuff. So this is what I'm going to start talking about more like the actual project, like, and what you're going to do, right? And some advice I have for this. Okay, so the project, so give me a thumbs up again, who's kind of at least breezed through like that README and stuff like that. Okay, I see some thumbs up. Okay, all right, I think most people have probably looked at it. It's under that final project. This is the whole snippet. Like I basically found like, this is really the project. It's like this whole section right here is basically your goal basically, or your scenario is that Microsoft, so those are your stakeholders, wants to basically build a movie studio and they want to see basically what kind of movies should they make. So I kind of highlighted some extra parts here. So your goal, excuse me, to get some water. So what they're doing right here is that you are helping them better understand the movie industry. Okay, you're basically taking information about the movie industry and you're providing that insight to them. You are, let's hear, your team is charged with doing data analysis and creating a presentation that explores what types of films are currently doing best at the box office. And note that best might mean a whole bunch of things, you know, like saying, okay, what does that best mean? You know, like, does that mean what kind of movies you're looking at? You know, do you split them up in movies? Do we adjust for inflation and stuff like that? That's something you might want to consider and stuff like that. What does it mean by best? Does it mean the most money? Does it mean the most popular? Does it mean most like highly rated? Like in the sense that like, you know, like most moviegoers really like it, or like, is it specific about critics, like film critics? Like, do they really care about it? Oscar winners, just a whole bunch of ways you can split this up into like the best, right? and you have to really decide what to do, or like multiple parts. You must then translate these findings into actionable insights. And I put this bold in here. All these bolds are my things. This is kind of what you need to do, right? Is that your goal is to like get insight and not just say, oh, here's a bunch of information, but with this information, telling your stakeholders, in this case, Microsoft making a new movie studio, of saying, these are the things you should do. So you can think of it like, these are the movies you should make, and be able to defend it with data, right? And say, these are the reasons why you should do these movies. Okay, does that make sense? So I think honestly, if you read nothing else on that whole like README, this is basically the whole project, like pretty much summed up. Like that's kind of like what your goal is. In the README, if you open up on GitHub, there's actually some provided like data files and stuff like that. But you can use web scraping, you can use an API. There's a whole bunch of things you can do to gather this information to understand the movie industry. Okay, so yeah, any questions on like what this looks like? So yeah, so overall, like if you remember, I'll kind of talk about this in a second, but like the overall data science lifecycle, right? This is kind of closer to the data acquisition side of like what data you're acquiring, and then exploring that data and analyzing it. Note that obviously we haven't gone into full detail like statistics, modeling, and all that stuff. So really what you're doing basically is doing an exploration and then making explanatory visualizations, explanatory findings, things that are actionable. So it's much more like on that, if you think like on that, remember that circle of data, we'll show it in a second, but that whole circle of like life cycle, you can think of it like the first 2 or 3 really sections of that point. Okay, so that's really what we're focusing on. So some advice. So one thing, and I'll repeat some of this stuff over and over again, so I'm sorry. Put yourself in the shoes of the stakeholder, right? What do they want to know? Is the information geared towards them? You're talking to non-data scientists. So one of the things that you have to do is that you're going to do a technical piece and a non-technical piece. Go into more detail about that. But if you're talking to a non-technical audience, think of like, what do your stakeholders want to know, right? And then making sure that information that you're giving them isn't over their heads. When I say non-technical, it means that someone who's not a data scientist, who's not doing data every single day of their life, they might have like, you can think of like an equivalent of math background of like high school like level, like not to put down anyone who's like, you know, out of data science. It's just like, you want to talk at that level. Like you don't want to make it so complicated. And trust me, sometimes you can get really excited and you end up talking about too much, like too intense, or showing visualizations that are actually a little confusing. But the main thing you should remember is that you're providing insights which lead to actionable items. So not only are you saying, oh, here's what we found, you are also providing, this is what you should do with this information. So for example, let's just pretend some things like, oh, we find that superhero movies are the most profitable for how much money you have to put in, and people love these movies. You should make superhero movies for that reason. Does that make sense? Okay, that was a very simple one, but like, I think that hopefully makes sense. So the main things that when I'm looking for assessments is that you are providing insights as a data scientist, but you're also communicating what to do with those insights. Okay. All right. Other thing to consider, do the data reflect what you are saying, right? So make sure like what you're saying actually is reflected in the evidence that you're showing, right? So make sure the data are complete. Like if the data are not complete, like you have to consider, why are they not complete, you know? In this case, it could be something like, you know, when I say complete, it could also mean accurate, right? It's that, you know, if I talk about like, oh, what's the biggest movie grossing, or, you know, what movie made the most money, right? Well, more recent movies are going to make more money just because of the fact of inflation, right? So consider that as part of your thing, right? Note that are the differences statistically significant? I put statistically because we haven't really talked about too much statistics, but basically saying, are they significant in this way? Like if you find something is like, let's just make up a really random things like $9 million and $100 and $9 million. Those really different from each other. It's like, like that's basically the same thing, right? Also the whole thing with inflation again, right? It's like considering that, are these differences actually relevant, right? You might see something $1 million and something that's $3 million, but they're 25, you know, let's say they're 50 years difference from each other. Well, you have to adjust for inflation. You're like, oh, it turns out this movie actually was done really, really well. Okay. And then what are the potential biases? So this is something, this will be a little bit harder to see because you're kind of gathering more movie data, but just kind of be aware of like what things might influence, how do I say this? like if you see the things that you want to see, if that makes sense. And we'll talk more about biases and stuff like this too, but like also the collection of data. If you're collecting data from, let's say, you know, whatever website about like movie ratings, be aware of how they do those ratings, right? Like, are these ratings based off of the general public? Are they based off of film critics? Like, there's a whole bunch of information on there of like what exactly that means. So just be aware of these kind of things that might be in, like, even though they are factually true in your data, they might actually be because of some other encoded bias. And bias just means like something that is like it's something about the data collection or the data interpretation, not necessarily like, oh, like I think sometimes when you say bias, sometimes it sounds very much like I don't know, like we think of like, you know, probably like racism, you know, stuff like this, but I mean something much more broader than that. Okay, makes sense. Cool. All right. Any questions for? I'm kind of trying to go quickly, but also like not too quick. All right. All right, so one other advice thing is emphasize your points with a narrative. So I'll talk about this again, like when we talk about like making your non-technical and your technical, but just know that we like stories. As humans, we like stories. We like kind of this flow from here to here. Like, oh, we start doing this. So this can be your technical and your non-technical. Non-technical, it's a little more obvious, right? You're like, you basically, your story is, we have this data. This is where we found this data. This is the reasons why we looked for this specific data. These are the things we found within this data. And that led us to believe that these things of what you should do. That's your narrative, right? You don't want to say, these are the results, here this, you know, this is where we got the data, you know, like, oh, and this is what we found. Like, you don't want to make it a coherent part. You want to lead them along the journey of like, you know, what you're talking about and like what kind of insights you have. Okay, does that make sense to people? Okay, and the technical part too, this is where we'll talk more about this definitely like in office hours and stuff, but in your technical, just because you do it in a different order, like when you actually write your notebook, your Jupyter notebook and everything like that, doesn't necessarily mean you have to present your notebook in that order. You might find, like, you might explore a bunch of things and you find this one gold nugget and you're like, oh my gosh, like I didn't realize this thing, right? And like, in reality, it took you weird paths and stuff like that to finally get to this point, but you can always adjust your, you know, quote unquote, your narrative of saying, oh, you talk about this thing like, okay, we're going to explore this part and this part, and you're like, and we're going to look at this thing over here, and you might ask yourself, why did I look over this way? And it's because it ends up leading to this, you know, gold nugget. Like, you can kind of like essentially like edit that story of like what you're talking about. We'll talk a little bit more about like what that looks like, but in general, it's that you're basically trying to make it easier for the reader and the person reading your report or your audience to understand your motivations of like why you went in this direction or like what the thing is important. Does that make sense to people? Okay, cool. Going along with narrative, use your visuals to emphasize your points. So explanatory visualizations, right? Your visualizations are emphasizing what you found, right? And you want to emphasize those points to your audience. That doesn't necessarily mean it's like all of the data and you show this to your audience and say, oh, and we decided to do this. You want to make sure that visualization makes sense for what you're concluding or what you're recommending. Does that make sense? Cool. All right, I see a couple nods. Stop me if you guys have any questions at all. Okay. So one thing when you guys do your presentation, one thing I'll say is that each slide should contain a single idea. That might mean that you split up your slides into smaller pieces, but the idea is that each slide has a coherent thought. In the curriculum, it says like something like 10 to 12 slides, just throw it out the window. Like, there's not a reason why there has to be specifically 10 slides. Like, I'm not counting, no one's gonna count. Like, some of the best presentations I've ever seen are people who have done literally like, one of the best presentations I've ever seen is I've done something like 50 slides over like 3 minutes, like, which sounds ridiculous, but like it worked really well because they basically had each slide basically went with everything that they were saying. So it works really well. I'm not saying that you should do that in this project and anything like that, but the point is that make sure your slides have purpose and make sure that they contain a single idea. And note that I say a single idea. If you put too many ideas on one slide, that's when you start getting into too much information. Basically, someone's getting an overload. Okay, sound good to everyone? All right, so I'm going to talk about the different parts of the project in 1 second, but I wanted to leave a second, just like any questions or any kind of clarifications or thoughts in your mind right now. Okay.
Sorry, how exactly do we get to this repo that we're looking at?
Yeah, so here, I'll show you. So this guy, and sorry, I have it in projects. Oh, you know what? I bet I haven't pushed it. You can see it's not here. It's actually in my other branch. I have to merge it right now. So eventually it'll be on the master branch. So I'll share this with you guys right now. But I'll tell you what, after this study group, I will make sure to merge that so that way you guys have access on the master branch.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Thanks.
No problem. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out because I forgot I didn't merge it yet. Things got away from me. It's been a busy day. All right. Cool. So I'm going to talk about them, the actual parts of your project assessment. And so your project assessment is many parts. So, well, it's not many parts, it's 4 parts. It's your notebook, basically your Drupal notebook. This is your technical piece, your blog post, right? So that's basically talking about your project. We'll talk about this in a second. Your non-technical presentation. So this is basically you talking to your non-technical stakeholders of your findings and your insights and the actionables that they should take. And then there's a video of your recording of your non-technical presentation, which, I don't know, depending how you feel, might sound really intimidating. It's not that big of a deal, okay? So let me go into some general advice.